Welcome everyone to our Energy Symposium. This series is now in its 8th year. Today's topic is human rights in the energy industry. The issue of human rights, the issues of diversity and inclusion, the issues of environmental, social, and racial justice, issues of human trafficking are places where, as institution of higher education, we should not only lead the implementation, but also thought leadership. The University of Houston is amongst the top most diverse Tier 1 universities in the country. And here, we celebrate our diversity and inclusion at all levels: students, faculty, staff, and programming, of course. UH is located in the midst of the historic Third Ward, and therefore we have taken it as our mission to engage with our neighbors, build partnerships with them, and address the issues of educational, health, and economic disparities. As part of this, we have developed our brand new medical school that focuses on primary care and addresses health care from a holistic perspective in our own neighborhood. We believe in demonstrating our leadership by doing, not just by talking. I believe that the energy industry has a similar commitment. In an independent role, the academic world has an opportunity to facilitate conversations between government and industry to bring clarity to challenging issues. Our consortium for energy corporate social responsibility is the perfect forum for this. We are very happy to have such a conversation on the fine line between the roles of government and industry in areas of human rights in the energy industry. Today's panel discussion is an attempt to further a partnership between the energy industry, government, and UH to address the human rights issues. I thank the panelists for taking the time to have this productive conversation. I thank the audience for their attendance. Have a very productive symposium. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Couture, for that wonderful introduction, and my special thanks to the panelists for being a part of this conversation. Welcome to the 8th year of our Energy Symposium series, Critical Issues in Energy. Today, we take on a very heavy topic on the issue of human rights and its implications to the energy industry and what next steps could be in this area for both the energy world, but also specifically in the issue of how human rights can be shaped by the energy industry. I'd like to offer my special thanks to the Energy Advisory Board, which has been fundamental in driving the university to have such conversations, to highlight the challenges and opportunities that the energy industry faces, but more importantly, society faces as we address the issues of affordable, reliable, and sustainable energy. We've been truly blessed to have a group of faculty at the University of Houston, whom we call the Energy Fellows, who have helped us create thought leadership pieces at the university that really drive the university to be seen as the energy university. And this is a moniker that we don't take lightly. We believe that there are at least 3 aspects of it that we need to be leading in and provide that leadership so that we can change the perception of education as it pertains to the energy world. Research, cutting edge research that drives new innovations, not just in technology and science, but also in policy and regulation. And third, and perhaps the most important one, and this is where the symposium really fits in, is how we can communicate difficult, challenging ideas with a broad group of our stakeholders, whether they be students, faculty, staff, or the society that we live in. And this is where our Energy Fellows really help us drive the conversation. A very special group that I want to thank is our Energy Coalition. The Energy Coalition is a group of about 5,000 students who come together from 10 different colleges at the University of Houston and represent the best and brightest in terms of energy, the future of energy as it pertains to the talent that is coming into the space. We're truly lucky to have such an organization that has withstood the trials and tribulations of the industry, with trials and tribulations of where energy goes, and yet be such a forward-looking organization that has really helped shape the conversation. The volunteers from the Energy Coalition much appreciate your help in putting this symposium together. Lastly, I'd like to come back and thank our panelists even before they get started, but I want to thank two people who really made this happen. One is Dr. Ravi Shankar from Occidental, and the other is Dr. Radha Krishnan, who is the director of the Consortium for Energy CSR. They have been instrumental in putting this event together. I want to give our special thanks to them to really put this together. So without further ado, let me introduce our moderator, who will then do the honors of getting the panel started. Our moderator is Dean Slocum. Dean is a founder and president of ACON International. And in the academic world, anybody with the title Dean is sort of the ultimate person at the institutions. But Dean and ACON International have been a global social and environmental risk management consultancy group that has really driven a lot of the cutting edge thought processes with regards to how human rights interfaces with the energy industry. As he self-confesses, he says he's a non-repentant sociologist with over 35 years of experience in advising global energy industry, solving some of its most pressing social risk challenges, including human rights. Amongst his accomplishments, the ACON International team routinely delivers human rights due diligence in impact assessment, benchmarking, and strategy development, and has found ways to remedy implementation for industries, investors, and governments here, both in the US as well as worldwide. So without further ado, Dean Slocum, take it away.
Ramanan, thank you so much for that very kind introduction. I appreciate that. I'm really excited about the discussion that's about to take place here on a very, very important topic. I'd like to start by just taking a minute to thank the University of Houston, certainly President Couture, Ramanan, Radha, and Ravi Shankar. Thank you so much for organizing this. And for the leaders in your organization, and for the many really talented professional team members you have that are working behind the scenes on this, that don't often get recognition for the great work that they're doing to make this all seamless. I want to give a shout out to them. I really want to thank the outstanding group of panelists we've been able to really fortunate enough to engage today to have this important discussion. And I'm going to introduce each of them personally in just a minute. And last, I'd like to just kind of connect with each of you on Zoom and whatever channel you're tuning in on, and say thank you for taking the time. This is an important topic, and we appreciate you dedicating your time to it. I recognize that with all the folks participating, there's a variety of different levels of awareness about human rights, and so I want to just take a minute to set the context so that we're all operating from the same level. And to do so, I want to ask you, no matter where you are right now, to take a minute, sit back, drop what you're doing, take a breath, and close your eyes for just a minute. And think about a time when you were unfairly judged, passed over, or even intimidated to the point that you weren't able to do something that you thought you had a fundamental right to do. How did that make you feel? Think about that. Now, think about a time, or think about some of the most deplorable working and living conditions that you've ever seen on TV or in real life. Horrible conditions that you would never want a member of your family working or living in. And imagine being constrained by another person or by an organization to have to work or live in those conditions. How would that make you feel? And how important would it be to have a basic right not to be constrained in that way? And how important would it be to have the right to feel protected from that? So these are questions we're going to ask. Just please open your eyes now and maybe join me in the gratitude that most of us will never have to worry about living or working under those conditions, and that we have the power to protect others from that. So today we're talking about the responsibilities of business and government to manage human rights. And Wikipedia's definition of human rights is as good as any, so I'll go with this. Human rights are the moral principles and norms that describe certain standards of human behavior and are regularly protected by municipal and international law. So despite those protections by law, right, almost a decade ago, the United Nations decided that there was a need to define governments and industries, businesses, responsibility for managing human rights. And so what it did is in 2011, the UN issued what's called the Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights. It defines that businesses' responsibilities are to respect human rights, while governments' responsibilities are protect those human rights. So the guiding principles are they've been a very, very useful tool. It's a very helpful distinction to guide both industry and government over the years. But what happens when governments are not able or willing or lack the capacity to protect human rights of people on whose trust business depends? What are businesses' responsibilities in those cases to protect and maybe remedy human rights violations? And how can business do that in a way that doesn't jeopardize its relationships with its governments? Well, these are really hard questions. They're difficult questions, but fortunately, we have a fantastic group of panelists who are going to help us deal with these. So I'd like to very briefly introduce each of our panelists, and then I'll go to each in turn and ask them to make some opening remarks. After that, we've got some specifically defined question for each panelist, and then we'll open the floor to questions from you, our participants. So we have on the phone with us first, Claire Larner. Claire is Director of Sustainability and External Relations at Newmont Corporation. Nili Savafi leads Human Rights and Social Performance at BP. Clarita Montan is a human rights specialist at Acorn International in Houston. And Tom Wilson is a partner in the labor, employment, and safety practice at Vincent Elkins, also here in Houston. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Claire. Claire is the Director of the Sustainability and External Relations function at Newmont, which is the world's leading gold mining company. Now, the mining industry has broken ground for the energy industry on human rights and sustainability matters, and Claire's work has been an important part of that groundbreaking. So Claire, I'd like to turn it over to you for some opening remarks.
Great. Thank you, Dean. And very typically my video is coming in and out, but hopefully my audio is okay. Can everyone hear me all right? Great. Yeah. Thank you. And Dean, thank you for that introduction, which was a very powerful reminder of why we take human rights so seriously and why we work so hard to embed respect for human rights in our organizations. So just briefly, maybe for those of you that don't know Newmont, we are the world's leading gold mining company and producer of silver, copper, zinc, and lead. We have assets in North America, South America, Africa, and Australia. And respecting human rights is really a core component of our purpose, which is to create value and improve lives through sustainable and responsible mining. I'm going to spend the next few minutes just talking about three things. Firstly, how we as a company have looked to embed key international frameworks like the UN Guiding Principles that Dean just talked about into our business. I'm going to touch a little bit on how governments and companies can mutually support each other in providing remedy or in addressing stakeholder concerns. And then finally, just think a little bit about how our role and the role of governments can become a bit blurred, particularly when we move beyond a do no harm approach, which is at the heart of the UN Guiding Principles, to thinking more about broader contributions to communities. So firstly, just thinking about Newmont's journey, we started really trying to interpret human rights for us as a business in the early 2000s. We made a number of attempts to understand what our role was at that time. And our first human rights standard was published in 2005. So as we know, at that time, there was no clarity on businesses' role versus companies versus governments' roles in this space. And so we did a pretty poor job, honestly, of internalizing human rights at that time and of trying to understand what it meant for us in terms of our systems, our processes, and our standards. So in 2011, when the UN Guiding Principles were endorsed, we really welcomed that as an opportunity to define what our due diligence practices need to look like in a way that made sense to us as a business. And Dean just gave you a bit of an overview of the UNGP, so I won't go into those in detail, but really just to say that government's duty to protect human rights and companies' responsibility to respect human rights exist independently of each other. So regardless of what a government is doing, we still have to be respecting human rights. And that means not infringing on the rights of others and essentially doing no harm. That's the baseline expectation of the UNGPs. And then both governments and companies have a responsibility to provide access to remedy. So that may be through judicial or non-judicial mechanisms, but those three components, duty to protect, responsibility to respect, and need to provide adequate remedy are really the core components of the guiding principles. So in 2014, we updated our human rights standard based off the UN guiding principles. We incorporated all of those due diligence requirements into our standard. And that standard has requirements that all of our sites have to implement wherever they are around the world. We improved our due diligence processes. We integrated human rights into our risk assessments, into ongoing assessments, and then outlined specific cases where we might want to undertake standalone human rights impact assessments. But really, integration was key for us. If human rights are going to be truly embedded, you need to think about your existing processes that they can be built into. And then we developed training for our employees and also our suppliers. We reviewed our operational level complaints and grievance mechanisms and made sure that they were adequately addressing human rights issues. And then finally, we improved the management of risk in our supply chain. Much like the energy sector, the mining industry has very complex supply chains, all the way through the mining life cycle, from exploration through to post-closure. And the complexity of those supply chains often exposes us to significant risks, particularly in the human rights space. So that has been a key focus of us. We've rolled out a supplier risk management program, which focuses on our supplier base and how we identify some of those human rights risks at the pre-qualification stage, at the awarding of the contract, and how do we manage those potential risks in that supplier life cycle. We have more about this in a modern slavery statement that's public on our website if people would like a bit more detail on that. So I mentioned that our responsibility has to exist regardless of where we're operating. All of those activities that I mentioned take place wherever we are, and regardless of whether the government is living up to their duty or not. I just wanted to provide a little example of how governments and companies can work together to provide remedy and to address stakeholder concerns. And this example comes from our Peñasquito mine, which is in Mexico. We have had a history of disputes with the Cedros community, which is one of the 25 surrounding communities around our mine. And those disputes have often resulted in road blockades and business stoppages. So in April last year, we really urged the government to form a multi-stakeholder dialogue process to address some of these concerns. And it was very successful in resolving a number of the issues. And then very significantly, last month, we signed a 30-year agreement with the Cedros community. There's many aspects to that agreement. Again, a lot of those are online, so I'd encourage you to look at that if you want more detail. But one of the crucial points of that agreement was that future disputes will be resolved through dialogue rather than through blockades or more sort of hostile action. So that was really fundamental for us, and again, couldn't have been done without the government playing that convening role. Then finally, it's often in supporting basic human rights, which really goes beyond the requirements of the UN Guiding Principles. As I mentioned, the core requirement of the UNGPs is to do no harm. But we know as businesses that we need to do a lot more than that as responsible members in society, to ensure ongoing community support and to really contribute to the long-term development of communities. We need to do a lot more than doing no harm. And it's often with supporting those basic rights, like right to health, for example, that we see a blurring of the lines between government's role and our role. And I'll just end with one example of this. We've committed approximately $5.5 million from a $20 million COVID Global Community Support Fund to health initiatives, various initiatives like supporting COVID testing and prevention, providing personal protective equipment to government facilities, government health facilities, and then supporting the building of an oxygen plant in Peru. All of these have had to be done, all of these initiatives and efforts have had to be done in collaboration with governments, with local district assemblies and health municipalities, to ensure that our efforts were not duplicative, that we were really targeting support where it was most needed. But I think that's often another space where the line becomes a little bit blurred between companies' responsibility and governments in supporting and upholding some of these basic human rights. I will end there. Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you, Claire. Very, very interesting. And it's a great view into how Newmont, one of the biggest mining companies in the world, deals with some of these key issues. We'll come back to you with some questions. But next, I want to go to Nili Safafi. Nili leads the Human Rights and Social Performance team at BP. Within BP's health, safety, environment, and carbon function. And prior to working at BP, Nili worked for the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. She worked for a number of human rights related non-government organizations, and she even worked with the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, all on protecting human rights. So Nili, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dean, for the lovely introduction. Hope everybody can hear me okay. I'm assuming if they can't, my fellow panelists will let me know. Lovely to be here with you today. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Where I am, it's the afternoon. I'm really pleased to have been invited here to speak with you virtually about BP's human rights journey. And I think this is more important now so than ever before. You might ask why. Dean said that the UN Guiding Principles of Business and Human Rights were endorsed by the UN Human Rights Council almost 10 years ago. So shouldn't we be taking stock? What's important about this moment? And I think what's really important is that human rights issues have really been pushed to the fore. Claire mentioned COVID-19. That's really magnified why businesses need to respect human rights and play their part, even in some cases, to protect human rights, those lines being blurred. We're seeing, the reason for this is we're seeing that the most vulnerable in society, if they don't have social protections, if they don't have a decent wage and access to healthcare, it affects all of us. The recent events that we've seen also in the US and the UK around Black Lives Matter, the migrant crisis in Europe and events elsewhere in the world point to how important it is that companies play their part in making societies more just, fair, and tolerant, and making sure everyone has access to equal opportunity, no matter where they come from, what their background is, their religion, their sexual orientation, their ethnicity, you name it, their race. And at the same time, society is telling our industry that we need to change, that we need to show that we are part of the solution to the challenges we face, including climate change. That's why at BP, we're reinventing. We're reinventing BP through our carbon ambition. We're aiming to get BP to net zero by 2050 or sooner and help the world to get to net zero by 2050 or sooner. And you can read on our website the 10 aims that we have to support that, and a lot more information that was released in September about how we're going to do that. And this is very much related to the new purpose of the company. It's all about reimagining energy for people and planet. And like Newmont, we have a long history of respecting human rights that stems back to actually security and human rights and work we did with mining, with government, with civil society on making sure that security provision for our assets is done in a responsible and respectful manner. That then led to many innovations and much progress we made. But in June of this year, and this is what I'd like to focus on, we did update our human rights policy. to take stock of the progress we've made to date, but also to build on that and to aim higher. The new policy strengthens our commitment to respecting human rights and to upholding the UN guiding principles. And it sets out some enhanced commitments in some key areas that I'm particularly proud of. It talks about and calls out the rights of vulnerable individuals and groups, and that we will respect those rights, and calls out specific groups, not to say that it's only those groups, but to place importance on people who may have historically been discriminated against. It talks about workers' rights and actually reaffirms our commitment to the ILO core conventions. We expand on respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples. And we call out specifically the rights to water and sanitation and land rights. And we talk about how we'll deliver on those, which is key in our industry. And importantly, we include a new commitment on respecting the rights of the human rights of human rights defenders and protecting them in certain situations. That's also really important given what we're seeing happening globally. 2 weeks ago, we announced a new sustainability framework. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that, but suffice it to say it has a people pillar which very much supports respect for human rights, equality, livelihoods, access to cleaner energy. And the reason that's important is it puts our people commitments alongside our planet commitments and our low carbon ambition. And that's really important because these three, you can't do one without the other. You can't achieve low carbon and no carbon energy without really looking after potential impacts on people and the environment and making sure that you're actually going above and beyond just reducing adverse impacts and trying to improve things for people on the planet. And equality is a hugely important part of this. That's why it's a prominent part of our sustainability objectives, our human rights policy, and in the US and the UK, we've recently announced diversity and inclusion frameworks for action that are focused on accountability, transparency, and talent. And our aim there is to bring about real change when it comes to racial equality in our own organization and play a larger part in remedying racial inequality where we can influence it, both in the US and around the world. So that gives you kind of the framework in which we're aiming to play. But I want to close with two concrete examples that really touch on what Dean really raised there, that intersection between the government's duty to protect human rights, especially when it comes to rights that are critical for workers and communities, and actually companies' responsibilities to respect those human rights, and where those lines blur, as Claire talked about. In the two practical examples that are very much supported by the structure I talked about, the first is related to the right to water and what is now in our new human rights policy. The second is related to workers' rights, which is also enhanced in our new human rights policy. In the first example, in Mauritania and Senegal, where we're building a large LNG project, some of you may know it as the Tortue project, our local team have consulted regularly with communities there, and that's right, that's in line with our human rights policy and our requirements in our management systems, because they're looking to understand what are the potential impacts of our project on people who live near the vicinity or who might otherwise be impacted by our activities. That dialogue resulted in a strong relationship with those who neighbor our sites. And during the early days of the COVID-19 crisis, the team identified a key need and were able to do something about it. They essentially had to step in to protect a local community's access to clean water. The community in question relied on water supplies being shipped in, and COVID meant that their deliveries were no longer forthcoming. Importantly, we didn't just decide to provide a short-term solution, we decided to go one step further to upgrade the water supply for that community and for the villages in that region, which will improve water volume and reliability of drinking water to around 7,000 people. To be clear, the lack of access to water wasn't due to our operational activities, but we felt it's important to support the community and the wider region to access what is a key human right, the right to water, which the right to life essentially depends on. Because it's the right thing to do, it's in line with our new purpose, improving people's lives, and because doing so helps to protect our social license to operate. The community needed us in their time of need, and we will need them and their support. So that was key. And you could argue that that was the responsibility of government, the duty of government to protect that right. But in that case, they weren't able to, and we were able to step in and support. The other example when it comes to workers' rights really is probably a broader example. It's not just one case, but I know in Houston, you guys have been very focused on human trafficking and trying to battle and address that scourge on, that thing that really adversely affects people. BP, we've been doing the same thing over the last 4 years. We've been reviewing conditions for the workforce on our project sites, on our operation sites, looking to see what the labor conditions are like, whether there's potentially forced labor, human trafficking, modern slavery, whatever you want to call it, but really looking out for that and seeking to remedy what we find, working with our contractors and suppliers. It's not always easy to do. And often we are going against, unfortunately, what's decades of poor practice in some parts of the world that have become norms, that have become accepted, things like retaining people's passports, charging people for getting jobs, charging very significant fees to get jobs, which end people in debt bondage, poor working and living conditions, etc. Where we find things, we are committed to fixing them, but we are by no means perfect, and it's not easy. At times, we have even had situations where governments have asked us not to intervene because they're afraid that we might set a precedent that would seriously adversely affect them economically. Nevertheless, we've pushed, we've done our work, and we have remedied where we have needed to remedy. We've worked with our contractors to get them to do the same. So essentially, as companies, we have a responsibility to look out for the rights of our communities and workforce. And in light of COVID, we all need to remain vigilant to protect the rights of those who keep our sites running. In an ideal world, it wouldn't be, in an ideal world, governments would do their bit to protect and we'd do our bit to respect. But actually, in reality, it's not that simple. And so we have to work together to do what we can to support workers and communities, especially in light of COVID-19 and in light of climate change. It's not us versus them, it's all of us working together, including with civil societies, the very communities and workers themselves, to try and improve things for everyone. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Millie, thank you. One thing that impressed me so much about your and Claire's presentations is that you talked about businesses' responsibilities, not that it's a moral responsibility, but that it's a business imperative that's critical for running your business. These are becoming core. Claire talked about it being a core function. You've talked about the business case for doing that. So I appreciate that. Our next speaker, I'm going to ask to talk about these issues from the government perspective. Clarita Monton is a human rights specialist in Acorn International's Houston office. Clarita's work includes performing human rights due diligence, impact assessment, human rights benchmarking, and awareness building worldwide, and also here in the US. Prior to working for Acorn International, Clarita worked with the United Nations in the Interparliamentary Unit in Geneva, helping advise governments on human rights matters. So Clarita, we'll turn it over to you.
Thanks,
and can we shift over? Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you, and thanks for the introduction. So hi, everyone. Thank you also to U of H for giving us the opportunity to be a part of this panel. As Dean said, my co-panelists today have talked about the business perspective of the responsibility to protect versus the responsibility to respect. So in turn, I want to talk about the government perspective. As per international human rights standards, individual states, and when I say states, I mean countries and governments. So individual states carry the primary responsibility to protect their populations from atrocities that can be genocides, war crimes, but also other human rights violations that may be caused by businesses. And as Dean and Claire mentioned previously, one of the foundational principles of the UNGPs on business and human rights is the state's responsibility to protect. So just to frame the discussion, I want to read to you the quote from the UNGPs about the state's responsibility to protect. States must protect against human rights abuse within their territory and or jurisdiction by third parties, including business enterprises. This requires taking appropriate steps to prevent, investigate, punish, and redress such abuse through effective policies, legislation, regulations, and adjudication. In the past few years, we've seen a number of governments that have either introduced or that have announced their intention to consider legislative frameworks to require companies and corporate groups to carry out mandatory human rights due diligence. And there appears to be particular momentum for these proposals in the European Union and also within EU institutions. The number and the range of domestic level frameworks and the proposals that are being implemented, I think really suggest that there's considerable appetite for this kind of reform in the field. And a lot of these proposals, came to life way before the COVID-19 pandemic hit. But I do think that some of the momentum can be attributed to the COVID-19 pandemic because it has really highlighted the fragility of the global supply chains, but also the extreme vulnerability of the people that work in those supply chains. So let me give you a few examples of the domestic level legal frameworks that have been introduced this far. I think the most far-reaching is the French Duty of Vigilance Law, which was adopted in 2017. And this law requires larger French companies to prepare what they call a vigilance plan. The vigilance plan has to be made publicly available, and it has to set out the company's approach to assessing and addressing not only human rights risks, but also environmental risks that are posed by the activities of the companies, that are posed by the activities of those companies that they control, and also of the activities of the suppliers and contractors with which they have a commercial relationship. And the companies that put out these vigilance plans or that fail to do so can be held accountable for these plans. And the way it works is that interested persons can make applications to the French judicial authorities to request that the companies comply with the law if they haven't, or if they haven't fully complied with it. So I mentioned the French Duty of Vigilance Law because, in my opinion, it's really the most holistic out there, especially and more in line with the UNGPs. But there are a few other national legislation that contain elements of mandatory human rights due diligence, and that include the UK Modern Slavery Act, the Australian Modern Slavery Act, and there's a lot of initiatives that are in the works, including in Switzerland, in Norway, in Sweden, and in Germany also. So all of this seems very European-based, and it doesn't mean that it's not coming to our side of the world. And by that, I'm in the US right now in Houston, so I mean the US. Because, speaking of that, in California, actually in 2015, they adopted the Transparency in Supply Chains Act. And this act contains also elements of human rights due diligence. It requires large companies to disclose to the public the extent of their efforts to ensure that the goods that they sell are not produced by people who are enslaved, coerced, or who have been victims of human trafficking. And to bring it even closer to home, in April of this year, the Houston City Council approved an ordinance requiring hotels to train their employees on human trafficking. And it's actually, Houston is the first major city in the US to have an anti-human trafficking ordinance, and the second city in the US after Baltimore. So this was definitely pushed, this ordinance was pushed by the COVID-19 pandemic because more kids are out of school, people are being, furloughed, laid off, which makes the communities a lot more vulnerable. But the Houston City Council has been working and fighting against human trafficking for a very long time, even before the COVID-19 pandemic. So going back on the government's perspective, over the years, the UN member states, again, I mean governments and countries, at the UN Human Rights Council have continued to support the mandate of either the special representative of the Secretary General or the working group on human rights and transnational corporations. And actually back in 2014, the working group was mandated to elaborate an international legally binding instrument to regulate in international human rights law the activities of transnational corporations and other business enterprises. So this, we're talking about a legally binding instrument at the international level. And a revised draft of this instrument was recently presented to the UN member states, and more than 90 of them showed interest in the initiative. I think what's really interesting about this initiative I was with the Human Rights Council a few years ago when they were already talking about it, and it's how really every actor is involved in the making of this instrument. So, you know, obviously states and countries are present, but civil representatives of the civil society are also present, and representative of businesses are also present. So everyone kind of gets to share their concerns, their support, or whatever it is in the making and the drafting of this instrument. And lastly, at the last Human Rights Council session in July of 2020, the Council adopted a resolution to extend the mandate of the working group for another 3 years, and at the same time encourage states to continue to implement and enhance their efforts to implement the UNGPs through legislation or national action plans. And this resolution was adopted unanimously. So I think what we see here really is that, you know, at the level of the UN, states are really pushing for more efforts, and they really want to fulfill their commitment to protect human rights. But I think in the transposition of these international frameworks to national legislation, there's a little bit of a gap. It seems that, you know, countries still don't have all those frameworks in place in their national legislation. And so I think the commitment is there, you know, when it comes to the UN and when it comes to those resolutions, but it's taking some time for the frameworks to be transposed into national legislation. So I will leave it at that and hand the microphone back to Dean. Thank you.
Thank you, Clarita. And, you know, both Claire and Neely talked about ways that their companies have kind of reached across that boundary to help governments protect and to help remedy human rights situations that were affecting their companies. And so maybe as we come back to you later, you could talk a bit about where you've seen that real-time experience with governments that have not been able to fulfill their responsibilities and how that's worked out. So very much not least, but last, I'd like to go to Tom Wilson. Tom's a partner in the labor, employment, and safety practice at Vincent Elkins, a law firm based here in Houston, where he's practiced for 35 years. Tom's the founding chairman of the Texas State Bar Association's International Human Rights Committee, and he's a leading legal expert and a dedicated champion on fair labor practices. Tom, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Dean. I think it's probably appropriate that a lawyer comes last because the law has followed behind all of these developments. You have heard, have you heard the various efforts, and Clarita talk about different government efforts. A lot of what we're talking about is what we lawyers call soft law. And that is, yes, these UN principles say this, or these particular government acts say this, but the bottom line is you can't sue my client under any of them. And that is something that I think we need to think about and where this may go in the near future in terms of developing law. As Clarita said, you know, there's the UK Modern Slavery Act and the Australian Modern Slavery Act. There's also the California Transparency and Supply Chains Act. All of them are generally reporting acts. And that means that my clients and those that are covered by those acts have to do annual reporting. It's a little bit of a name and shame type of thing, because if you don't report, if the report is faulty in some ways, you may get some bad publicity, but that's about the extent of it. And Clarita is exactly right. The French corporate duty of vigilance law is much more aggressive in that it actually has a provision in there about preventing human rights violations, which is a big step forward in terms of how the law is developing. Now, of course, that law only applies to very large companies headquartered in France. So it's fairly limited at this point in overall application. And then you have the issue overall of, as Clarita was pointing out, many governments simply are not in a position, either because their rule of law is weak, or because of corruption, or maybe worse, gets in the way, and you actually have a government that either ignores human rights violations or actually participates in them. So there's often an issue for individuals who are subject to these types of violations as to, okay, where do I get my remedy? If I can't get it here in my home country, where do I go? So I want to talk a little bit about how that is developing. And in particular, I want to talk about two different cases that are pending that are, I think, important for all of us to keep an eye on. The first one is a case that was filed in 2014 by 3 Eritreans who filed the lawsuit against Nefson Resources in Vancouver, Canada. They alleged the company was complicit in the use of forced labor by Nefson's local subcontractor, a company called Fagan Construction, which is actually owned by Eritrea's ruling party. It's all at the Bisha mine in Eritrea. And Nefson is actually headquartered in Vancouver. The plaintiffs claim that they worked at this mine against their will. They were subject to cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment. And they allege they were forced to work long hours and lived in constant fear of threats or torture, intimidation. So when the case was filed, Nefson filed a motion to dismiss. At every level in the Canadian legal system, that motion to dismiss has been denied at the trial court, the appellate court. And this last February, the Canadian Supreme Court denied that motion to dismiss and is allowing the Canadian courts to continue to litigate this matter, largely based upon the plaintiff's argument that such breaches of international law also constitute a violation of Canadian common law. So you're taking soft law and suddenly saying it's part of the hard law of Canada. That's a big development, and it's going to be very interesting now as the trial court reviews this case to determine if actual human rights violations have occurred, how this proceeds. It may take years. It's already taken, the case was filed in 2014. These cases can take a very long time, but it will be interesting to see how this develops. We have a somewhat similar case pending here in the United States against Apple, Google, Dell, Microsoft, and Tesla, all brought under the US Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which was a law that's actually been on the books since 2000. It's pending in the federal district court in Washington, D.C. The allegation is that each of these companies knowingly benefited and aided and abetted the use of young children to mine for cobalt in the Democratic Republic of Congo. In late August, the defendants filed a motion to dismiss, which I think all of us in the legal world knew this was coming. There's a deadline for a response from the plaintiffs at the end of October. The basic defenses are that there's no standing for these plaintiffs who are all citizens of the Democratic Republic of Congo to file this action in the courts in the United States, and that there's also no standing because when there's injuries that are caused by third parties who are also not in the United States, the plaintiffs therefore lack standing under the laws of the United States. The defendants also say that the plaintiffs have failed to state a claim because the Trafficking Act requires a knowing benefit from the participation in an illegal venture, and venture is a term of art here, and they have to participate in a supply chain that is not sufficient, to remove this harm. Anyway, this will be very interesting because if the court was to accept the plaintiff's version that a supply chain is a venture under the Trafficking Act, that suddenly will make this game very serious for a lot of companies in terms of doing due diligence on their supply chain. I personally don't think this district court is going to take that action, but I think this is a case that eventually is going to be heading up probably all the way to the United States Supreme Court someday. So we have some developments happening here that are going to impact potentially multinational corporations that are headquartered particularly in Canada or the United States, but who have operations around the world. These actions may follow on the social developments here that we've seen in the recent months. It'll be interesting to see how all of this impacts the courts as they consider this. This is going to be a slow developing thing, though. I have to say, as a lawyer, if 10 years ago we would have had a meeting like this, I think everybody who would have attended could probably fit in my office here, and we would have still been able to socially distance. Now we have a far larger audience for this topic, And I think that's going to put a lot more pressure on the development of the law here. And so I think it's going to be interesting. I think there are a lot of ways that companies are looking to be proactive in this area. And I think you've heard some of those already. I will say, I've been involved in multiple joint ventures where we have done joint ventures with local companies to try to remedy issues on the ground, doing training and so on. It's often difficult. There are risks because some of these governments that we've had to interact with are not necessarily governments that we want to interact with, but this is in the energy industry. You go where the minerals are, and that is a limitation on the business. And sometimes we simply have to deal with governments that are not necessarily the ones we'd want to deal with, but we have to deal with them carefully, particularly for those of us in the United States because of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So I'm going to leave it with that as a quick rundown on where we are on the hard law side of this. It's still developing, but we have a lot of things going on that we need to keep an eye on. Dean?
Thank you, Tom. Great follow-up to where we had Claire and Nili talk about business responsibilities. Clarissa talked a bit about kind of looking at it from the government perspective, and you've shared with us the idea of where we're going, what pressure points are going to be put on this balance between respect and protect from the soft and hard law perspective. And that last point you were getting into about which countries do we go to and what are our responsibilities, well, I would like to come back to you on that with a follow-up question to dive a bit deeper. But first, back to Claire. Claire, could you give us, and I ask each of you guys to maybe we are going a little bit long, which is great, really in depth, but I do want to make sure we leave time for questions from the floor. So I'd ask each of you to just take a minute to respond to the following questions. And the first one was for Claire. Claire, can you just give us some example of how Newmont worked with governments to support your role in to support their role in protecting human rights, as well as your company's role in respecting human rights? You're on mute, Claire.
Hi there. Sorry, can you hear me now? Gosh, you think this long of working remotely, I'd be able to get the unmute thing sorted. But there were so many interesting nuggets from Tom's piece, but hopefully we can pick up on a couple of those in the Q&A. So thanks, Dean, for the question. As we all know from the UN Guiding Principles, this piece around leverage is really important. So they state that businesses need to exercise leverage where they can prevent or mitigate an adverse impact. The point of leverage is also one of the most complex pieces of the guiding principles to implement. But I'm just going to provide a very quick example from Suriname and how we worked with the government there around respecting Indigenous rights and around getting them on board with our approach. There's quite a lot of background to our history in Suriname, which I'll skip over in the interest of time, but we started working through partners on the ground in 2004 there, looking at some exploration in a part of the country where we later developed a mine. In 2004, there was no real understanding of this notion of free, prior, and informed consent, and I'm sure many listening know about FPIC. It really is the mechanism to safeguard individual and collective Indigenous and tribal rights. But in 2004, there was no recognition of how you implement FPIC as a company, and our explicit commitments to FPIC came a lot later. So when we got to the development stage of the mine in 2013, we realized that we had not lived up to the principles of FPIC, and we really wanted to address that moving forward. So against that backdrop, we hired an independent expert panel convened by an NGO to look at what we had done up until that point and to think about what we needed to do moving forward to better align future work in country in Suriname with the principles of FPIC and also elsewhere internationally. And we wanted those learnings to be not just for us as a company, but for the wider mining industry. And so that report is public. You can find it on our website. There was a lot that we learned through that process, but crucially, we learned lessons around how we conduct our impact assessments, and that we need to start truly inclusive engagement much earlier in the process, truly inclusive community engagement. And that informed our approach to exploration in another part of the country, where we engaged the government and the community much earlier on in the expansion process. And critically, and quite challengingly at the time, the government of Suriname does not recognize traditional, tribal, or indigenous land rights. But we knew that we did not want to proceed with exploration until we had FPIC from this traditional community. So we brought the government along in that process with us, and eventually they agreed that we would need to get consent of that community before they even granted an exploration license. So that giving of consent was actually filmed on camera because it had more meaning being conducted verbally than a written agreement. And that was pretty powerful for us as a company to embed those consideration of rights really into our decision-making process at a very early stage of a project development. I'll pause there. I'm sure I went over a minute. Sorry, Dean.
It's very interesting, Claire. Thanks for that. We have some terrific questions coming in from folks who are participating, and so I want to make sure we have time for that. So please try to keep your responses short. And Neely, to that point, I want to ask you a question that we've talked about in advance, but there's another question that came in that's similar to that. So I'm going to throw you a bit of a curve and expand the pre-planned question, if you don't mind. BP's CEO recently stated their intention to transform from an integrated oil company to an integrated energy company. So the question is, what role does just transition play in that change? And to add to that, I wanted to talk about a question that came in about renewable energy. And the question is, it's a bit of a long question. It says, in the renewable energy industry, there's abusive labor conditions and land seizures that disproportionately affect indigenous people, people of color, and low-income communities. Therefore, how does the solution we're trying to achieve with climate change not only mean decoupling economic growth from fossil fuel, but also healthier communities and individuals? A lot, but yeah. I'll leave that with you.
Does that mean I get 2 minutes, Dean? No problem.
No, you have 2 minutes. You have a 2-minute rebuttal.
I'll touch on the first point and then into the larger question, really, I guess, of how can renewables really be done in a way that respects communities, workers' rights, and contribute to healthier environments. In terms of the first piece on the just transition, essentially, and the question that was just asked, respecting the workforce and local communities is key to enabling a fair energy transition, and making sure that communities and workers aren't left behind as we transition to lower carbon sources of energy. And in doing so, that we work with government, civil society, and trade unions. And there's a couple of practical things, that we can really do to make sure we provide opportunities for people to develop new capabilities, to support jobs and livelihoods, and to enable communities to benefit from future resources. There's the policy space, and BP and others in our industry are participating in that policy space and looking at what we can do through advocating policies around net zero, making sure that the use of finance and revenue from carbon pricing supports a just transition. We've taken part in the Vatican dialogues on this topic around carbon pricing, but we're also working with IPICA, and I'm sure we have colleagues from IPICA on the call today, to look at, what does a just transition really mean for our industry, and how can we make sure that we can do things practically on the ground as part of that transition to make sure that communities and workers benefit and are respected. In terms of what we do today, I think through social investment and our work with local communities, we can help make sure people benefit. And we've done projects in Indonesia and Angola around local access to energy that are very respectful, and that actually in Indonesia, we helped provide cleaner energy sources to local folks at our West Papua plant. That goes to the question that was just asked, that actually improved air quality, that improved health outcomes from that community, because we were helping them switch from diesel generators, which they relied on for energy with pretty adverse impacts to people's health from inhaling the fumes, to actually much cleaner sources, still related to fossil fuels, but cleaner sources of energy that enabled them to have round-the-clock power, that powered the hospitals, that made sure that there was continuous power so that children could work and do their homework at night, right? Things like that that we take for granted. So that it is possible to do, and is possible to do in a way that respects human rights. And through APICA, we're coming together to look at what more our industry can do. Right here in the US, right here, I'm not here in the US, where you guys are hopefully in the US, BP has recently helped to found something called the Coalition for Better Business Environment, and they are supporting the Transport Climate Initiative in northeastern states and mid-Atlantic states in the United States. And the aim is to improve transportation, to improve the transportation so that it's lower carbon, develop cleaner energy economy, and reduce carbon emissions from the transport sector. But what does that do ultimately? Well, that has direct benefits on the just and fair energy transition by providing cleaner air, by supporting healthier communities, by supporting job creation. And importantly, they've built in ways to help make sure that communities will benefit from equitable and clean mobility solutions. So to the point of what that person was asking about Indigenous communities and others, it's always about taking a look at where you're going to do whatever project you're going to do for whatever type of energy you're going to develop, and say, okay, who are the people who are going to potentially be adversely impacted? Let's talk to them. Claire was talking about early engagement. Let's understand how we might adversely impact them, and let's build in mitigations from the beginning, but also let's look at what opportunities they can have from what we're doing and how they can benefit from it. And if you do that, and if you really take into account the UNGPs, I think you'll be absolutely fine. And there's loads on the IPICA website that talks about how you can do these kinds of things through impact assessment, through engaging with communities, through community grievance mechanisms, through due diligence, to really understand the human rights situation in a place and make sure that you plan properly and you do your developments and your projects in a way that really respects communities and workers and gives them benefits.
Excellent. Thanks, Nili. I appreciate your flexibility to take two questions at once. And Clarita, I'm not going to spare you from the same fate, unfortunately. May I ask someone at U of H to put the IPICA website up address for people to see? That would be IPIECA.org. There's an excellent set of resource pages there on human rights that I'd recommend everyone to look at. And if not, we'll get that out to everyone, as well as the connection to the link for the UN Declaration, but also UN Guiding Principles. And Nili, you were talking there about your first point, right? Which is do the least harm in all of our work. So that's this kind of came back to that for me. Clarita, can you give us an example of where you've seen where governments have not been able to fulfill the responsibility for protecting human rights, where industry has successfully stepped in to protect and remediate? And then on top of that, we have a great question from the field in a place I know you've worked, so it's a little bit different question, but I think it's relevant. The question is, governments seem to be most interested in economic benefit from energy development. And a case in point is Guyana and Chile. So the question is, how can human rights of the native people in those countries and those of the workers be protected by the governments? What are the best practices, especially in the developing world?
Sure. Thanks, Dean. So
Yep.
I'll start with the first question, and I'll give an example of a project that we worked on at Acorn with Acorn International. So this is taking place in Brazil, and an Australian mining company commissioned us to perform an independent labor rights assessment of one of their main suppliers located in Brazil, so that we could investigate reports of conditions analogous to slavery in its charcoal supply chain production, supply chain. And so this happened because the Brazilian government had named and shamed the supplier by putting them on a list of companies that were allegedly involved in slave labor. But at the same time, the government was not consistent in its auditing and monitoring, and they didn't necessarily have the capacity to do so. So they kind of just put the supplier on this naming and, on this list and named and shamed them without any kind of follow-up. And so this is where the Australian mining company, who really wanted to continue to do business with its supplier, stepped in and said, all right, if the government is not going to go through the process of auditing, of really looking at what's going on the ground, we are going to do it. And so that's why they commissioned us with the labor rights assessment, and we were able to, confirm that there weren't any conditions analogous to slavery. And I think this is really important also because, both Claire and Neely were saying earlier that businesses and governments, independently of each other, have a responsibility for governments to protect and for businesses to respect. So the responsibility still exists regardless of whether the government is fulfilling its duty or not. And that's exactly what happened here is, the business decided to step in because the government wasn't necessarily fulfilling its responsibility. Now to your other question, Dean, or I guess to the question from the floor about best practices, especially for the developing world. I think I would see two kinds of best practices. One of them, unfortunately, is naming and shaming, because that attracts a lot of attention. Like Tom mentioned earlier, the case in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, as soon as it gets in the newspaper and the headlines, it attracts more attention, and that's usually when businesses or governments with businesses are going to start making changes in the way that they do things. Another best practice that I've seen a lot in the work with Acorn is investors. Investors and foreign companies that go and work in, a developing country oftentimes have their own standards, and they want to work according to what they call good international industry practices, and those are their standards that they strive for. So even if the national laws don't go as far as those international standards, they are going to want to comply with those international standards. And I think that's really been a push from part of the investors and from part of those companies that go and work abroad to, encourage more human rights due diligence and encourage businesses to work with better practices.
Thanks, Clarita. I appreciate that. It's a good input. And I know in the case that you talked about in Brazil, not only did that company do an assessment, but they took them really much more aggressive step and said, we're going to step in and train this workforce on labor rights. And we're going to put in place a self-auditing program and a grievance mechanism that we'll pay for, will help you develop those mechanisms and to roll them out, because the government was able to do that. So very, very helpful. Tom, you started to talk about some countries where governments countries where businesses may want to think twice about going in terms of their ability to manage human rights. Industries such, particularly the energy industry, have to operate in locations where minerals are located, and many times those minerals are located in areas with in countries with high human rights risks. So the question on this is, how do managers of companies in these industries address the potential that shareholders are just not going to tolerate that company going in to these locations and managing and being able to manage these risks tolerably?
Well, I think the first answer would be to hire people like Claire and Neely and have them work on your programs, because I think that would get you a long way toward that goal. Obviously, part of this is a communications question. You have to make sure that your shareholders are aware of why you operate in certain parts of the world. It kind of goes back to the old saying, and the ship in a harbor is safe, but that's not what ships are built for. Well, an energy company that only operated in West Texas may be safe from many of the things that we're talking about today, But that's not necessarily what your shareholders want you to be doing. And so there needs to be an explanation for why is the company needing to operate in difficult areas. And let's face it, some of these are very difficult. If you lay over there these heat maps for violations of human rights issues around the world, you lay those over where gas and oil deposits are found, they match up, unfortunately, very well. And some of the countries are particularly difficult. I mean, I think it's really important for everyone to have heard Neely talk about successes in a country such as Mauritania, which is a very difficult place to operate in this area. Mauritania is the last country in the world to outlaw slavery, and it only did it in 1985, so not that long ago. The bottom line is you don't want to embarrass your shareholders. I think we have an example of that, recent example of what can happen if you do that, with the context of, you might have seen last week, Alphabet settled its shareholder lawsuit over the handling of the sexual misconduct claims that it faced, and the fact that it had paid out large sums to several executives living in the realm of all of that controversy. It's a settlement of $310 million. They've announced 5 new principles they're going to follow, set up a diversity council. It is a situation where I think it is something we can all learn from in this area, and that you don't want to be there. And so you want to do the type of due diligence to make sure you're going into your operations with your eyes wide open. You understand what the risks are. You do the work with the local indigenous people that Claire was talking about, and you think about how can we benefit the people in this area where we're operating, in a way that we are not doing harm, but we also doing good. And I think that's a way you kind of can manage these difficult situations for the energy industry.
Thanks, Tom. Just a quick follow-up. One of our questions had to do with that, but went beyond to what you talked about and said, what about when you're working in countries that are not only have high human rights risks, but actually what you're trying to do is in conflict, or there is a conflict with local law and your company's policies?
Well, this is difficult, and I think probably I want to have Neely or Claire join in on this too, because I have a feeling they may have faced these issues. But I mean, this is a subject where direct dealing with the government is needed. You need to explain why you have these operations and why you need to operate in the way that is appropriate for your company. You might, as a company, also engage your own country's State Department in this effort to try to involve them on your behalf. But at the end of the day, if there's a true conflict and you cannot overcome it, then that's where you face the question that we were just talking about. Do we continue with the project if we simply can't operate in this country and abide by our principles?
Great. Thanks, Tom. And, Claire, so one of the questions that came in really for you is related to this. The questions, there's a growing need for a variety of minerals such as cobalt that are being mined in challenging areas like Republic of Congo. So this is directly what Tom was talking about. The question is, what challenges to human rights do you see, and how do we advance a conversation that's both coherent and ensures successful development of the countries at the same time, as well as their society and their business?
Yeah, thanks, Dean. Excellent question. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep.
Good. So firstly, we don't operate in the DRC nor mine cobalt, but some of the challenges that we see there, we see in places where we do operate. So just one of those challenges, for example, is artisanal and small-scale mining. So that can be the sometimes illegal, sometimes informal activity that happens around our mines, and we see that in Ghana and we see that in Suriname. I think previously ASM was seen as a real risk in terms of the health and safety impacts, the environmental impacts, the negative human rights impacts associated with it. But increasingly, it's also seen as an opportunity, particularly when it's a legitimate livelihood. In Suriname, we have ASM around our operation that's been there for generations. So companies need to think about how can they start supporting legitimate livelihoods. and there are tens of millions of people affected by ASM globally, and there's a real opportunity there to use it to lift people out of poverty if it is a legitimate livelihood. So that's sort of, I suppose, a mutual challenge that we share with the DRC. In terms of advancing the conversation, I think that no one company can advance the conversation on its own. I think finding those multi-stakeholder groups that address issues across the whole value chain is important. So we're a member of what's called the Responsible Minerals Initiative and their mining engagement team. And that includes us as sort of upstream companies. It includes refiners, smelters, and then all the way to downstream users like tech companies and like jewelers. And that allows you to have a conversation about risk across the whole value chain and about opportunities across the whole value chain. So I think finding those kind of forums is really important for advancing the conversation. And then finally, legislation can be a key driver for change. We've seen that in the DRC through the Dodd-Frank, and I know that there's been various reversals of elements of the Dodd-Frank legislation, but that at its heart is trying to drive performance improvements and improvements around due diligence and transparency of due diligence activities. We've seen the Modern Slavery Act in the UK and in Australia. We've seen some of these EU mandatory due diligence pieces coming out. I think those legislative drivers, coupled with multi-stakeholder forums, are really important. Thanks.
Thank you, Claire. Appreciate that. We've got just a few minutes left, so I'll ask for some really quick responses, but great questions. Neely, this one to you. What's the role of the energy industry in addressing issues of environmental justice? I'm sorry, that one wasn't for you. I want to get to the environmental justice question, but my apologies. The question for you, Neely, is access to energy has become a fundamental need and right, and vulnerable people face the greatest challenge here. How does BP ensure access to energy as a fundamental right? And if I may merge again, we've got a lot of questions on how does COVID-19 exacerbate the needs and increase the responsibility for companies?
Sure, Dean. So I think I'll do my best to answer really quickly, but I think the lawyers in my company would not like me to talk about ensuring access to anything. But the truth is, at the end of the day, we can do a lot to play our part in helping to make access to affordable, cleaner energy available, right? And actually, that's part of what we're trying to do with our new carbon ambition. So I encourage you to go have a look at our website. It's all about getting to net zero for us, but helping the world to get to net zero. And alongside that, we have commitments in our sustainability framework, which are precisely about this point, is providing access to cleaner energy for more people. We don't have all the hows worked out just yet, because this is all really new stuff that we've announced, but it is absolutely doable. Some of the ways that providing access to cleaner energy and making sure that the poorest benefit from it, that some of the ways that that's doable is through things like microgrids that can be developed in places where people don't have access to energy. And then when the actual grid gets there, and I'm not an expert in this area, forgive me, our expert in BP would probably slaughter me for the way I'm describing it, but when the main grid does get there, it's actually a lot easier to then connect up that microgrid and people can have access to the main grid. But in the meantime, you can do a lot with microgrids, you can do a lot with renewable energy, and you can build that in. And some of, so for example, Shell and Total have actually announced targets on this about how they're going to actually, how much energy they're going to be able to provide through renewable means for people that don't have it by certain dates. So it's absolutely doable, and using impact investing and social impact investing are key ways to do it, so that you do it in a way that can make money, but money is not necessarily the only driver. So it is a business and profitable thing, but the social impact is also one of your drivers. So that starts to address the issue about the fundamental need for energy and the need for cleaner energy. The other point, Dean, I think I've somewhat lost. COVID-19. Yep. So how does COVID-19 exacerbate vulnerabilities? I mean, look, we're in it at the moment, and I think a big commitment from businesses like ourselves, and I'm sure Newmont and others, is about how do we help society build back better. But the vulnerabilities are multiple fold. it's impacts to health, it's greater poverty that we're seeing, it's business revenues coming down, it's governments having so little bandwidth to deal with anything else than the ultimate health crisis and the economic crisis, that so many of the other things take a back seat. So there's multiple different issues, and people are, unfortunately, vulnerable people are more adversely impacted in ways that are inequitable. So it is fundamentally, in my view, a human rights crisis. How can we do more? Well, I think we're all trying to do our very best. In BP, we have made donations of PPE. We've made sure that ambulance services and people who work in the medical space get free fuel. We've provided delivery of food to people who need it most, to elderly. And we've done things like what we did in Mauritania and Senegal that I described, providing access to water. There's a lot we have done. There's a lot we will continue to do. We've also made a very significant donation to Mind, the mental health charity, because fundamentally we also believe that there's a really big issue here with the uncertainties that people are facing and the real mental health challenge, as well as a big donation to the World Health Organization to try and help with this practically. So I'd also love if people on the call have ideas of what businesses can do more of. Hey, we're all ears. We want to learn, we want to listen. We don't have all the answers, but those are some of the ways that I think we can continue to play our part.
Yeah, here's a great opportunity for the great researchers and thinkers at the University of Houston to get out on this and help the energy industry. And don't forget to work with your social scientists as well. Ramanan, do we have 2 more minutes? I wanted to get to an EJ question for Tom and Clarita. I know we're a little bit over.
Yes, we do. We have time. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So just quickly, maybe a 30-second response from each of you guys. Environmental justice, EJ, what's the role of the energy industry in addressing EJ in a way that's associated with energy development? And the follow-up question here is, can you talk about it in the context specifically of the US? Ladies before gentlemen, Clarita?
Thanks, Dean. So I'll talk about it very briefly in the context of the US. I think it's important to remember that environmental justice is, it's linked to any other injustices that are happening in this country. And there's actually a study that showed that in the Northeast, about a little under 70% of on average, communities of colors in the Northeast breathes about a little less than 70% more air pollution from vehicles than other residents. And so it's just, I think, really important to think of the link between environmental justice and other injustices that are happening in the country and how those are affecting populations that are maybe already vulnerable for other reasons. So that will be my short answer. I think Tom can elaborate a little more.
Yeah, Tom, and then what's the role of the energy industry in managing addressing these issues?
Well, I think obviously the role of the energy industry is one around communication and understanding. I mean, we're getting better data all the time so that we can actually take appropriate actions around this. I think it's a difficult issue, though, partly because our infrastructure in the energy industry is fairly old, and it's been in place, and communities have grown around it. And so we have some real challenges in this area. There's no way I solved this in 30 seconds. I think the best I can say is this is a challenge, I think, for the industry going forward. And it's obviously one that's going to receive more and more attention.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Clarita. So Ramanan, I just saw a note from you. Would you like to close us out, or would you want to ask each of the panelists to make a closing remark?
I think it'd be great if each of the panelists can give us a closing remark, and then Ravi Shankar has a comment, and then I will come back on. So.
Excellent. All right. I really mean it this time, guys. 30 seconds each. If you could just offer from the remarks and the exchanges we've had here, any follow-up thoughts that you'd like to leave the participants with? And I'll start with you, Claire.
Thanks. I'll be very quick. So obviously not being in the energy sector, but I thought that I might just piggyback on this environmental justice question. So firstly, there are two elements of this. And the first is that we need to address past injustices. So we know many areas of the US have outdated facilities, like outdated chemical plants that are poorly controlled, that have significant pollution issues that negatively affect the environment and health. And we need to make sure that the poor and minority communities, often where these outdated facilities are located, have equitable access to clean air and water. And they also have access to legal remedy to address some of these historical injustices. So that's the first piece, addressing the past. And then in thinking about moving forward, and Nili picked up on a lot of these pieces in terms of leaving no one behind, we need to ensure that as we transition to a low or no carbon or green economy, we don't exclude Black or Indigenous or people of color. And everyone needs to have equitable access to that clean energy and meaningful jobs to support that industry. So there are things that companies can do in terms of providing technical training, which contribute to pathways out of poverty and support upward mobility and autonomy around green tech. We can provide startup money, or the energy sector can provide startup money for clean tech and green financing. But we also have to address those historical issues as well. And I will end there. And this has been such a fascinating panel. So thank you so much for including me.
Thanks for being part of it, Claire. Nili.
Yeah, so I think really what I want to leave everyone with, we've talked about a number of things in terms of where we've come from and where we're going. And I think for me, it's really about how we continue to partner and work together. And when I say partner and work together, I don't think our industry can do this on our own. We need support from our customers, our clients, the people with whom we want to work with in future, and others with whom we already work. So for example, the mining industry. So looking, and that's part of the reason BP has set up a team called Region Cities and Solutions, like looking to see what does the world need and how can we partner with others to deliver that in an area of the energy transition, but also in making sure that that is a fair transition and that is a just transition. And we don't, we have a lot of the potential solutions up our sleeves. For example, looking at how we can band together to support good initiatives that are lower carbon and that also provide jobs and provide access to affordable and cleaner energy. But we can also look at how, for example, carbon pricing can support those who are perhaps most adversely affected by historical injustices. But we also don't have all the answers. And so I really want to appeal to those on the call today, the university students that are listening in. We want to hear your ideas. We want to hear those researchers' ideas. We're listening, we're being humble. We've got some ideas of how this could work, but a lot of this is uncharted territory. So I'm listening. I'll share my email address. Give me your ideas. Let's talk. Let's work this out together, because I really do truly think that by government, civil society, academics, NGOs, communities and workers working together, we will address the challenges that we're facing, whether they be COVID, climate change, the energy transition, injustices, etc.
Thanks, Nili. Super quick. We've got a minute left. Clarita, last things you'd like to leave the panel, the group with?
Yeah, so I think what I want to leave the group with is, I think the COVID-19 pandemic has changed a lot and has accelerated a lot of what we have been discussing today. Companies and governments have had to adapt to that, and they will continue to have to adapt to it. So I think human rights has really, the pandemic has really shed a light on human rights and brought it at the forefront of a lot of the discussions. So I want to leave, the group and the audience with the conviction, because I am convinced that this is all going to change really quickly and that it has really been accelerated by the pandemic.
Yeah, great. Good point. And then Tom,
yes,
parting thoughts.
What I would say is that given that there are people like Claire and Clarita and Nili involved in this and who are devoted to it and very smart and really thinking it through, I actually think while we have a lot to do, the future's fairly bright in this area. We are going to get better. And what I just hope is in my world, in the legal world, as laws develop, that they actually support their efforts and not inhibit them.
Great, thanks, Tom. And you're very humble there. You've been a leader in your profession and beyond as well in this area. So thanks for that. Ramanan, let's turn it back to you.
Well, thanks so much, Dean. I'll just call on my colleague, Ravi Shankar, to just say a couple words.
Yeah, I mean, what a very, very impressive and breadth of coverage on this topic. I want to thank all the panelists for being available and sharing your thoughts and ideas and expertise. Any time that I approach this panelist along with the team, you've been very ready to participate in this. We want to sincerely thank you for your participation. I thought right from the beginning when Renu Couture started all the way to the end, been very, very impressive coverage. Dr. Renu Couture very rightly mentioned about the role of UFH on this topic being located in the third ward and how important it is from an environmental, equity, justice, and human rights issues, how UFH should play a role. I do want to thank her for a message. Certainly, I would like to thank Dr. Ramanan as well as Radhakrishnan for having provided this opportunity to take up the issue and deal with this. I do believe that we have been, as an advisory board to UFH, we have been talking about conducting a series of discussions on human rights. So certainly we'd like to follow through with the support of UFH. I want to thank Dean very, very sincerely. Dean, I have always recognized your expertise in this area, and most importantly, your pragmatism and how you have applied, balanced the various difficult policies versus practice has appealed to me very, very much. And thank you for taking the time to be available and doing an excellent, excellent job of moderating this panel. Again, the panelists, the breadth of your expertise, knowledge is phenomenal, and I'm tempted to organize once again the same panelists for further discussion. So stay tuned for that. With that, I'm truly humbled by what I heard, and I really like the optimism and note that all of you left, and especially Tom Wilson. Your conclusion of the optimistic note has been wonderful. Again, I want to sincerely thank, and Dr. Ramanan, I want to give it to you back, and thanks for helping to coordinate this discussion.
Ravi, thank you so very much. Appreciate those comments. I believe we have the IPCA slide on. When you get a chance, Iggy, do show that web address. I think it's an important one for all our audience to sort of see and learn from. I want to thank our panelists, Claire, Clarita, Nili, and Tom. Amazing job. And Dean, you did a job of coordinating and moderating this that I think is qualified you to be a moderator for just about any panel, including the election debates. You did an amazing job. So thank you. At the university, we obviously take this issue of human rights and corporate social responsibility seriously. Two things that you should be aware of. One, we're going to be starting a micro-credentialing program very soon, middle of October or late October. We'll be sort of launching that program on micro-credentialing in the area of energy-related corporate social responsibility. And a second one, a follow-up discussion on what we just heard today in November. But in between, during the month of October, we're going to take you through a journey on every Friday morning, 10 o'clock every Friday morning, 10 to 11:30, with 4 panels that are going to outline how Houston can become the low carbon energy capital of the world. And we'll start off on October 9th with a panel discussion on carbon capture, utilization, and storage. On the 16th, with how the electric grid is going to be transformed, and Houston can lead that. October 23rd will be a discussion on the hydrogen and hydrogen economy. And on October 30th, we'll talk about the circular plastics economy. These are studies that were carried out by the University of Houston, along with the Center for Houston's Future. There'll be white papers coming out on those topics, but these panel discussions will really talk about it from a global picture with the idea of how Houston can become the low carbon energy capital of the world. With that, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today. Look forward to seeing you back here on 9th of October. And again, thank all my colleagues, both from UHIT as well as from UH Energy, for their help and support in putting this together. Thank you and have a great day. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.